Well, joining me now from Washington to go through the latest in the Trump transition is New York Times Magazine chief national correspondent Mark Leibovich. Okay, Mark, boy, is this sort of blocking of some of Trump's plans by President Obama? What do you make of this? Is this something that really will stick come the new administration?
Well, I mean, it'll make it more complicated and more difficult. I mean, I think Donald Trump has spoken over the last year and a half almost as if he can sort of come into office, sort of snap his fingers, and a number of things that he's been talking about will just come to pass. I mean, I think what President Obama is doing is, I mean, he's doing stuff that he actually seems like he believes, obviously, and this is not something that, will come as any surprise policy-wise to people who have been following his administration. But him acting this late, him doing this, seems like a pretty clear-cut way of, if nothing else, putting some roadblocks in between Donald Trump and enacting what he has spoken about on the agenda, on his campaign, which are his agenda, which is obviously, in opposition to his predecessor.
So when you talk about all these unprecedented moves that President Obama, some people are calling it, that he's trying to enact, do you think that could actually open the door for Mr. Trump to have greater powers down the road and say, hey, look, he tried it, he did it, why can't I?
It could conceivably. I mean, I think every sort of presidency and every administration puts in place new things that at the time looks like it's advantaging them, which then a few years later, when the other party is in power, turns out to be something that the other party is against. I mean, you see that in how, say, the Senate, regulates filibusters, how they change rules, depending often about what party is in power. So, yeah, I mean, it could. I mean, President Obama has certainly been unshy about exercising executive authority, executive orders, and there's certainly a precedent that he is putting in place that could, in some ways, empower Donald Trump.
I'm curious, Mark, what you think about the new role for Kellyanne Conway that she's going to play in the Trump administration. What do you make of this newly announced position in the White House?
I don't find it that surprising. I mean, it's surprising only in that there's been, Kellyanne has said in a number of occasions that she's very hesitant to actually go into the administration, at least in the first wave. Look, I mean, she's his campaign manager. Clearly, she's being rewarded for helping lead his victory. He clearly trusts her. She's clearly been very loyal to him in his mind. And I think it makes perfect sense that something like this would happen. I mean, it's obviously, this is actually more in the realm of what typically happens when new administrations come in. New presidents bring people that often help them get elected. David Plouffe, who ran President Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, eventually came into the administration. Jim Messina, who ran his 2012 campaign, worked there previously. But it's all, the political arm of what a president does, does to have a level of continuity between what they do in a campaign setting, what they do in a transition setting, and what they ultimately do in the administration. So I don't think this is surprising at all.
There's some buzz that the Trump administration was somehow going to limit daily briefings at the White House. Is there a sense of if there are any changes that'll come to the West Wing with these new folks?
Well, there are rumblings about that. I mean, I think the key hires here will be certainly whoever the White House press secretary is going to be. Sean Spicer, who has been the RNC's spokesperson, sort of most visible spokesperson over the last few years, is seen as the front runner for this job. The communications director's job, it's unclear. But I think that Donald Trump has proven again and again that he has no problem whatsoever skirting some of the traditional communications pipelines and getting a message out. I mean, tweeting is something that he has continued to do. I assume he will do it as he gets into the White House. So, yeah, I think we're certainly on some kind of collision course with a pretty dramatic change in precedent. I think the new media landscape does kind of lend itself to this in some ways, but the question is to what degree how far is Donald Trump and his team willing to go with this, and how much power is he going to limit with the people who traditionally cover him in the media?
When you look at the cabinet that he's put in place, there are, by some accounts here, 11 millionaires or billionaires. 7 are former CEOs. And today he tweeted, quote, "Someone incorrectly stated that the phrase drain the swamp was no longer being used by me. Actually, we will always be trying to DTS." That's in response to comments, of course, that his ally Newt Gingrich made about draining the swamp. Do people care, Mark? If he sticks to this campaign promise of draining the swamp, and is that really going to happen?
Well, it sort of depends on how you define draining the swamp, right? Does that mean you're not going to hire anyone who hasn't been in business, who isn't rich? I think traditionally what the swamp has meant in Washington is someone who was part of the permanent sort of political class revolving door of big business, lobbying, public office. I mean, it's all sort of one big swamp, if you will, of sort of shared interest in which everyone's kind of in on the game together. You could very much argue that Donald Trump explicitly said on the campaign trail that he is going to, drain the swamp of lobbyists specifically. He is not going to give any influence to Wall Street specifically. Goldman Sachs was someone he singled out specifically during the campaign as a kind of real boogeyman for his campaign. As it turns out now, I mean, there were a lot of lobbyists involved in the transition. Goldman Sachs has been, the workplace of some pretty key advisors in his administration, and Wall Street obviously has been very, very, well represented so far. Again, particularly Goldman Sachs. So, I mean, how do you define swamp? How do you not define swamp? I mean, you can keep using the term all you want, but ultimately, it sort of becomes sort of subjective, and you don't really know what it means anymore. So, I mean, there have been a number of things that he has appeared to do a 180 on. It's unclear whether people will actually punish him for saying, hey, you said you're going to drain the swamp, but here we have lobbyists, here we have Corey Lewandowski, another former campaign manager, opening up a consulting shop in Washington. That looks like the kind of influence peddling that a lot of people were sick of in Washington that you ran against. So, I mean, we'll see how it plays. But right now, there's certainly, the makings look to be there for some kind of charge of hypocrisy there.
Okay, Mark Leibovich from the New York Times newsroom. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Rena.